I'd like to introduce Dr. Crystal Collier, who herself is a person in long-term recovery. She's a therapist and an educator whose comprehensive prevention model, which teaches the neurodevelopmental effects of risky behavior in children, teens, teachers, and parents, was selected for the 2015 Prevention and Education Commendation from the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence.
Paige, you just did an awesome job. That's a long sentence.
Thank you. In 2018, she received the Torchbearer Award for her work in the field of addiction from the Texas Association of Addiction Professionals. And in that same year, the Hope and Healing Center of Institute in Houston, Texas, granted Dr. Collier a research fellowship to support the completion of the Neuro Whereabouts Guide. And I think you've got a copy there. Perfect. And we have a little bit of an end to help get you connected with one, perhaps two. And in 2019, she received the Outstanding Research Award from the Association of Alternative Peer Groups and was acknowledged as a Counselor of the Year by the Houston Counseling Association. And Dr. Collier, I don't know if you go into what the alternative peer groups are. Okay, but if people
I can absolutely
what that even is,
yes,
somebody might, because that's a new concept here in Oregon.
Okay.
At First Recovery High School that probably I think a lot of people just don't even know about yet because it's so brand new to us.
Okay.
So with that, welcome, Dr. Collier.
Oh, thank you guys. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, thank you guys all for coming. I really appreciate it. So it is 8:37 my time. So I normally would be getting into bed right now. So if you see me, it's like a little yawn there, please forgive me. But I will also want you to know that I'm going to have a lot of information coming at you tonight. This presentation really kind of has 4 sections. So I'll let you know when we kind of get to each section. So you can kind of pause and think, okay, here's some questions for you. But what we're going to do is we're going to first do a little brain primer. And then we're going to talk about how the brain becomes addicted, high risk, like what that looks like. Then I've got a section where I picked out a few different high-risk behaviors. I researched 18 different high-risk behaviors in the book. And in the book, it's really cool because I put a graph for each one of them. So you know when they peak, so that as a parent or a facilitator or staff, you know when to have the conversation with your kiddo. I also wrote it in infographic style. So there are lots of fun graphics. No topic lasts for more than 2 to 4 pages. But back to the presentation. The last part of the presentation, we're going to talk about prevention, treatment, what prevention science says you can do, where to get genetic testing, what really cool stuff. And so, like I said, at any time, if you have questions, please feel free. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and share my screen with you here. I also will share my presentation with you guys. If you would like a copy of the slides, just let me know. I can also just send them to Pam and she can send it out to you. But please feel free to use anything in it. Also, the book is really well referenced. I probably read over 500 journal articles on all those high-risk behaviors. So you know that it's really science-based. And so here's the cover of my book, The Neuro Whereabouts Guide. The idea behind this really wordy title is that I wanted parents to not know just where their children are in the world, their whereabouts, but I wanted them to know their neuro whereabouts. So where is your child's brain developmentally, and how do you parent toward it? So I do a lot of parent coaching in my practice. I'm a therapist and an educator. I work at the University of St. Thomas here in Houston, teaching counseling skills, and I do a lot of prevention. You guys, this week was my first day back in public schools. It was so nice to be in a class with kids. I just so enjoyed it. But so all the things that Paige read earlier are definitely my credentials. But what really qualifies me is what happened to me when I was growing up. So these are pictures of me when I was a wee one. Here is me at 5 years old when I was a real blonde. And I always think about this is my inner child picture. You guys know, when you have this picture in your mind, when you think of it, that's me. And my family was intact and happy and doing well until this picture when I turned 11, 12. And my parents got a divorce. My mom and I moved, and I moved every single year thereafter. Started experiencing lots of social anxiety, feeling uncomfortable in my own skin, feelings I had not had as a child. And then, of course, we were moving all the time. And so I just felt like I could not get ahead of what I was supposed to learn. And by the time I got to my first school, I thought, okay, I got this brilliant idea. I'm going to take summer school classes to get to know kids. Now, you guys know that's kind of a crappy idea, right? Because the kids who have to take summer school are the ones who didn't make the best choices. So I met this really cute boy who said, oh, I'll introduce you to all these kids, and here, have some alcohol. So I took my first drink at about 12 years old, and I loved it. And I thought, man, why hasn't my mom told me about this? Like, this is awesome. I'm the life of the party. I didn't have that social anxiety. All that went away, and I started using everything I could get my hands on. By the time I was 16 years old, with this wonderful feather hair that I had back then, another cute boy said, you really shouldn't snort cocaine. Let me show you how to use it in a needle. Again, I said yes to that. So from 16 to 18, I had a pretty bad intravenous drug habit, but was always did really well in school and had all these summer school credits. So as soon as I hit senior year, I didn't need that. I was done. And so I moved out, moved into my own apartment, got a job waiting tables, got a drug dealer, got a roommate. And I thought, man, I can do this adulting stuff. And then all of a sudden my hair started falling out, and I was losing weight, and my gums were infected, and my 4.0 in my first semester became a 3.0 in the next semester. And then I failed out in the third semester and dropped out of school and had an overdose. By the grace of the force of the universe, I survived that overdose, picked up the 100-pound phone, called my mother and said, I need help. She helped me get into rehab. And that's this picture, the day I graduated from rehab, with big Texas hair and a t-shirt on that says drug-free body, that I still have today. So you guys, I've been sober since February 3rd, 1989. 32 years I just celebrated. But I always tell kids that, it's not the big happy story that you can just go out and shoot up a lot of dope and survive and you're fine. Because what happened afterward baffled me. I spent years in therapy feeling shame and embarrassed and not understanding why this cute, sweet, smart kid made all these choices. And so I started studying and reading everything I could get my hands on. And it was a great time to go to school because all these brain studies were being published. So basically what I'm going to share with you guys today is what I learned in the synopsis of 1 hour presentation. And interestingly, now that I'm a therapist, I get asked this question a lot. You guys probably do too, mostly from adults. Is it really that bad? As a parent brings their kid into my office who just got expelled from school from smoking weed. And I did weed when I was in high school. I'm fine. I drank when I was in college like a fish, and I'm okay. Well, you guys, the way that I answer this question is with this statistic. 90% of adults who struggle with addiction to anything, whether that be a behavior or a substance, began engaging in that behavior when they were a teenager. And if you look at longitudinal studies, you will find that the younger someone is when they start using, the greater their risk of growing up and being diagnosed with an addiction or struggling with abuse for decades in their life. But if you look again at that longitudinal data, you'll find that the kiddos who waited until they were 21, they almost completely eliminated their risk of growing up and struggling with any kind of addiction. This piece of data alone, like you could just drop the mic and be done here, right? I mean, like this says it all. This is the reason to empower you to say to your kids. And so many parents will say to me, you mean even drinking? I'm like, yes, it's underage drinking. You know, there are so many reasons that you should say no. And the research is really clear about this. If you did it, your kids will know if you're lying if you tell them you didn't. But I'm not advocating to lie. I'm advocating to tell the truth. But when you tell the truth, you also do not glamorize the positive. You talk about, yes, I drank when I was in high school, but man, when my dad caught me, woo, he whooped me good. Or when my mom found me drunk one night, I was so embarrassed and she was so, you know, that's what you talk about. So when I looked at this longitudinal data, I thought, what the heck is causing this almost perfect slope down? What is going on at this age? And that's when I started to really realize it's everything about what's happening in the brain. Okay, so 2 phases of brain development. Phase 1, birth to about 11, 12, when we grow 200 billion neurons in our brain. And by the time we're about 6, we've got about 90% of those. But then when puberty kicks in, the growth of neurons stops and the growth of 2 other substances begins. And in order to make room for those substances, we lose half of our neurons. So phase 2 is about reorganization. Phase 1, neuronal growth. Phase 2, reorganize. This is a critical time of brain development, which we'll talk a little bit about what this does. But what I learned about this is that like half of your brain cells is a lot to lose, but it's really critical that we do. If you end up at 24, 25 with 200 billion neurons, it will take you so long to process it, you won't be able to do it. So what the brain is doing during this phase is creating a fast, efficient processing machine. And here's how it does. This is a graphic representation of a neuron. And you guys can see the myelin sheath that covers the axon. Myelin starts to thicken in phase 2. Now, electrical impulses move down the axon, and the thicker the myelin, the faster processor you are. So the good news is your processing speed peaks at the age of 25. The bad news is it's slowly downhill from thereafter, right? As you guys all know who are above 25, that our processing, like how quickly we think, just slows down. So processing speed and myelin go hand in hand. The next thing that is growing that needs room in the brain are these wonderful things at the end and the beginning of the neuron called dendrites. Dendrites are my favorite brain structure because every time you learn something new or practice something, you grow another dendrite. Dendrites are literally the hardware of learning in your brain. So let me show you a real picture of what this looks like. This is a little baby infant neuron. And you can see that long axon, the cell body, and then what looks like tree roots or tree branches, those are dendrites. And as this little infant's brain grows and develops, you can see the thickening process and those dendrites reaching out as this baby is learning over time. And so there's a point where you can't see through this because by the time you're 25 years old, every single neuron in your brain is linked to another one via is linked to 10,000 other neurons via dendrites. So you make these really long strings of neurons in your brain that are networked, and then they get squished down inside the skull to make, because you've got this, skull that your brain has to grow within. And that's what makes all those funky, cool wrinkles in your brain. Now, this entire process is, it looks really like this from the outside in. And before this study was done, scientists thought the brain grew in kind of a uniform way. And there are many parts that do, but this growth that we're talking about is primarily in the prefrontal cortex. You can see it here thickening. The darker the color, the less gray matter. So that's the actual cells. We're losing cells, but we're growing, especially here in the second phase. You can see the thickening, the myelin and the dendrites. That's what is represented by the darker color, which is really what we call white matter, the fat and the connective tissues. Now, this is interesting because we do have a frontal lobe when we're younger, but as you can see, it's just immature and underdeveloped. We get to about 10 or 11 years old, and we've got about 10% of what will be our adult brain. And then we get to 16, we got about 45% of our adult brain, which is freaky scary, because what do they give us a license to do at 16 with half a brain? Why our insurance rates are so high and why we get into so many accidents. And then at age 20, which is as far as this study went, you can see that it's like 80%, which is mind-blowing because you still have a whole fifth of brain development to go between 20 and 25. Really critical time of brain development that's all governed by the use it or lose it principle, which says your brain decides which neurons to prune away by what you're using. The ones you use get left behind and interconnected with all of those other neurons making the networks. And so, if you're really good at reading and writing like I was when I was a kid, I developed long strings of neurons for reading and writing, but I hated math. So I have really short networks in my brain for doing math. But that's okay, because I hired an accountant who has long strings of neurons in her brain for math. And she could hire me to, do therapy work for her and things like that, right? Okay, so, but what does the frontal lobe do? Like, it's other really parts of the brain working together that do math and reading and writing, but the frontal lobe is critical because it's been nicknamed the CEO of the entire body. Now, here are the two levels of, they call them scaffolding levels of skills that grow as a child develops. The first phase, phase 1, birth all the way up through elementary and middle, we grow what scientists call lower level executive functioning skills. Now, as you read through these, I want you to think about your kids and, which ones they struggle with, which ones they're good at, how old they are. These are the ones that we need to get kind of up in the morning, remembering our lunch, out the door, coordinating our activities, the basic ones. Then we hit puberty, which kicks in phase 2 of brain development. That starts around middle, through high school, through college, and beyond, when the next level of scaffolding starts to emerge and our kids start to grow higher level executive functioning skills. Now, you guys, these are the ones that we need to get up and out of our parents' house, fully functioning, self-supporting, relational adults. And there's one here, impulse control, that is the #1 predictor of success as an adult. How well you can self-control, control your impulses. If you've ever seen the marshmallow test out of Stanford, you'll find all of that research that shows that. But here's my favorite executive functioning skill, this top one, abstract conceptual understanding. It allows our kids to move from concrete black and white thinking into the gray. Now, unfortunately, this causes them to kick in their argumentativeness. But remember that when a kid starts to argue incessantly, that means their brain is developing normally. And that should give you a little gratitude and solace to know as they're incessantly, irrationally trying to argue with you. But you actually need abstract conceptual understanding to really feel and express empathy. So it is a critical higher level executive functioning skill. Okay. That is your brain primer. So that is the end of section 1. Now we're going to start on section 2. and start to answer this question. How do drugs and alcohol and other high-risk behavior affect the brain during these critical growth processes? So if you have any questions, please feel free to just unmute and ask now if you'd like. But I'm just going to keep going with this. So the answer to this question lies within our limbic system. So this is my favorite picture, this cool 3D image of it right here. It shows you all of those really old organelles. That's what they call them. They're so tiny, but they really do. They are an organelle, and so they are an organ, but they're so small that scientists name them organelles. Most people know the limbic system is where fight or flight is, but what we're going to talk about is the fact that your limbic system is where all pleasurable experiences begin and end. And it has everything to do with our favorite neurotransmitter, dopamine. Now, you guys know we have lots of brain chemicals. Serotonin governs mood. There's norepinephrine that gets us activated. Lots of different chemicals in the brain, like there's GABA that helps us focus. Dopamine's job is to keep us alive by signaling that we are doing something good for our survival. And so when we engage in something that is salient, or otherwise known as good for our survival, it gives us a sense of well-being, calmness, and happiness. That's why I think it looks like this picture here on the right, like fairy dust, right? I'm sure it lights up in the brain. I'm just sure that it does that. So let's talk a little, I'll give you a great example. If you have not eaten for 7-8 hours, you forgot lunch, dinner is forthcoming, but it's a ways away. You guys know how you feel. You get hangry, you get moody, you get tunnel vision. Basically, your limbic system is saying, hey, you need to go do something good for my survival. And until you do, I'm going to make you feel really miserable and uncomfortable. And then as soon as you eat, you get 100% increase in dopamine. Now your limbic system is saying, hey, good job keeping me alive. Here is your reward. Feel calm, feel happy. We'll do it all again in 4 or 5 hours. Another behavior that we do when we're married and protected, right, guys, is sexual behavior. So, sorry, I work in schools, so that I always have to say that, right? So when human beings engage in sexual behavior, we get a dopamine increase of 150%. So now the limbic system is saying, hey, this is really good for your survival and your species survival. So we're going to give you more. So you'll keep doing this. And if you think about it, like these two combined is a really good date night, right? Y'all, I have to tell you, since we're among adults, my husband saw me do this presentation once and he said, you know what? If we don't flip the order of those, the second one never happens anymore. It's like, you're so right, honey. So we have dinner earlier now, right? As we get older, we have to compensate for our dopamine spikes, right? Now, these are normal, natural dopamine spikes from healthy adult behavior. Or healthy behavior that keeps us alive. But then we've got these drugs of abuse that spike dopamine levels really high in our brain. If you snort a line of cocaine, you get a 350% increase. Methamphetamine, 1100% increase. Heroin is about 1300%. I couldn't even put it on this chart because you couldn't see food or sex anymore. And if you kind of think about it, like that's what happens to people who become addicted to opioids or heroin. They stop eating. They stop having sex. They stop having relationships. They stop communicating with other people. Smiling, eye contact, those things also spike dopamine levels. Exercise, all of those things. And the brain, the limbic system gets hijacked. Your brain is really, the limbic system is good at math. The limbic system does this simple calculation. It's reactive. It says, man, when you put this in my body, I don't know what that is, but when you put it in my body, I get 250% more dopamine than when you put that in my body. So this must be 250% better for my survival than that. Now, the part of your brain that knows that's not true is your prefrontal cortex, but it is otherwise off when you're high on drugs or alcohol or other high-risk behavior. I mean, think about it. When you overeat on like Thanksgiving, which is like the holiday of binge eating, when we overeat on Thanksgiving, we go into this food coma. We don't want to do, executive functioning. We don't need to sit and have empathic conversations or do problem solving and decision making because you're in a total food coma. Your limbic system is lit up and your frontal lobe's like, you're good. I'll come back online in a few hours. Now, here's what is really critical to understand about how addiction happens. Our brain has something called the hedonic threshold. So that word means pleasure. And here is a line that indicates where it might be. What this basically means is that our brain naturally can increase dopamine levels up to roughly about, let's say, 200%. Every person is a little bit different, but we all have a threshold of how much dopamine we can produce in any one given experience. And we go up and down within this threshold on any given day. Your dopamine plummets because you're hungry, you eat, it goes back up. You get bored, you get lonely, you connect with your loved ones, you go exercise, all the kinds of things that you do during the day to keep you alive and happy. But there are two structural changes that occur when we go above our threshold. And that's either with behavior or it's with substances. So I'm going to show you guys a video of both of those. Okay, so if we travel deep inside the limbic system and you take a look at those neurotransmitters that are producing dopamine, let's say that you drink and your neurons are producing all this dopamine. They're coming across on the dendrite where all the receptor sites are. It's making you feel really, really, really happy, but you're binge drinking. So it's depleting that neuron and it can't produce the same amount of dopamine anymore. This is why as high as a drug will take you, it takes you equally as low. And if you've ever had a hangover, you really understand this. You don't feel good for hours or maybe even days afterward. But the good news is that those little neurons will heal and replenish their stores of dopamine, and then you can go back to feeling normal. Unfortunately, if you're using heavier substances like meth or alcohol, or heroin, or combining it, you could do damage to those neurons and they may not replenish themselves or take years to replenish. Okay, that's the first change. The second change is the more devastating change because you can't unchange it. When you flood the synapse over the threshold with so much dopamine, those little receptor sites on the dendrites are like, whoa, we don't have enough room. So we better grow more receptor sites to handle this influx of dopamine that's coming in. More and more and more and more receptor sites, more and more structure. Now, you can't unmake new brain structure. Once it's there, it's always there. And that's why we have a saying, once an addict, always an addict. Now, this can take years or it can take days, depending upon the strength of the substance that you're using. Now, think about it. All of these new receptor sites in there are screaming out from dopamine once the dopamine from the drug or whatever leaves your system. They're screaming out. This is interesting because that video can really show you how a tolerance builds and how craving and withdrawal happen. Because you add a little bit of structure and next time you have to drink more to feel the same feeling, but then you add a little bit more structure and you have to drink a little bit more next time to feel the same thing. Now you've got all these receptor sites that are empty and screaming out. So interesting what happens. That can't unchange. Okay, now this is the hedonic threshold. If you have no genetics in your family for substance use. But what if you do? If you have any of the 2,200 genes that have been associated with alcoholism, drug addiction, or mental health issues, you may have a lower threshold that would be indicated potentially by this red line. And so let me kind of set this up for you. The body has 30,000 genes. Your genes tell your body what to do. I have a gene that says I'm going to have green eyes. I have a gene that tells my pancreas how to work. I have a gene that tells my brain how to make dopamine and how much to make. But my brain, because I have a lot of those 2,200 genes associated with addiction, those genes have morphed. And those genes in my body tell my brain to make less dopamine. It is something that we call reward deficiency syndrome, or RDS. So the geneticist who really led the team that discovered all of these, his name is Dr. Kenneth Blum. I actually had a phone call with him a couple weeks ago. I asked him if he would write a review of my book, and he agreed, which makes me so happy about that. But he actually started a company that does genetic testing. I'm not financially associated with them, so I don't get anything for mentioning it, but I just think it's so important that if you're working with families who have the genetics, that it's really important to get their kids tested. You think you even get themselves tested. And I'll show you what that looks like at the end. But when I learned that I had so many of these genes, it really helped me understand that I just process alcohol and drugs differently. My threshold is lower. I don't make enough. But I'm also more sensitive to it. So if you think about, like, say, two people, one person has the genes, the other one doesn't, and they spike dopamine levels equally as high, like that first spike right there. The person who has the genetics, reward deficiency syndrome, they don't make enough dopamine and their threshold is lower. So when they spike dopamine levels to that red line, that's when their brain starts making structural changes. But the person who's drinking and using right along next to them and using the exact same amount, that dopamine spike does not come close to their threshold. So they don't have any structural changes. They have to use above their threshold to start having addiction occur. This is why I have so many kids that I see that fail to launch in college. It'll happen every June and every December. I always get a lot of kids who are not doing well in school, and they will say to me, man, I was drinking like everybody else. I was using like everybody else. The first question I always ask them is, okay, well, tell me, do you have any of the genes in your family? And they always say, oh yeah, my dad is, or my mom is, or somebody is. And so that can really help explain. About 1 in every 5 people have some genetic risk for addiction and mental health problems. Okay, so let me show you what it looks like from the top down. The top 3 brains, functional MRI looking from the top down, the color indicates blood flow and activity, and this brain is completely stone cold sober. This is what we want our brain to look like so that we're functioning at peak performance and focus. The brain at the bottom shows somebody who's high on a substance. Limbic system lit up, frontal lobe off. We used to call this arrested development, but today we call it hypofrontality, from pleasure. You can also have hypofrontality from fear. If you're in chronic stress, if you have a lot of adverse childhood events going on, you may have a brain whose limbic system is on because it's in fight or flight, and the frontal lobe is off. But if you are using substances or engaging in addictive behavior between the ages of 11 and 25, I should really say between birth and 25, while your brain is growing, if the frontal lobe is off, it doesn't get to grow. So if somebody starts using here at age 12, when their frontal lobe looks like that, and they use regularly up until the age of 20, their frontal lobe would not look like this one if we took a picture. It may look more like this one or even this one, depending upon how often they used. So this is where a lot of high school kids will say to me, well, what if I just try it once? And this is when I say, okay, if you drink alcohol, I'm going to guess you're probably not going to just sip a little bit of wine. Most kids who try it binge drink and get really drunk. And if you do that, you're going to shut off your frontal lobe for about 1 to 3 days, because alcohol has a half-life of about 48 to 72 hours. And so if you did that once every month, and we multiply, let's say conservatively, 2 times 4, that's 8 days out of every 30 days that you're going to have a rest from your frontal lobe being off. And so, do you want your frontal lobe to be off that often? Most kids will say no. If it's marijuana, very different. Marijuana's half-life is about 1 to 2 weeks if you just use it once. If you are a moderate user and you use it 2 to 4 times a month, you're looking at 3 to 4 weeks before it's out of your system. And if you smoke or vape THC every day, you're looking at 6 weeks before it's out of your system. So even if you smoke once a month, you're potentially looking at 1 to 2 weeks of some sort of arrested development throughout a childhood's developmental brain. So you can see this is scientific justification for keeping a brain clean and healthy, because I feel so lucky, you guys, that I stopped at 18 and I had 7 more years of brain development to go, but it takes a long time to heal. This is a cocaine abuser's brain 10 days sober. You can see that frontal lobe is still off. This limbic system, detox city, screaming out for that drug it thinks it needs to survive. And here is the same person 100 days sober. What you've got is the brain is turning back on at, a little over 3 months, but it takes this person about 18 months to return to this level of functioning up here. And so, getting kids clean and sober, we got to do that young, because we got to get their frontal lobe to heal and turn back on so that it hopefully will bounce back. The beautiful thing about adolescence is that it is the time of greatest plasticity, which means that it is flexible and it grows the fastest during that stage of development from around 11 to 25. But we got to get them clean and sober before then. Okay, so that is halfway through. Now, let me move into the third part, which is where I'm going to talk about a few specific things that kids do. We're going to start with substances. Every substance that we know out there, no matter if it's an upper or a downer, they all either increase dopamine levels. Some of them increase a lot of other chemicals, and some increase really focus on like 1 or 2, but dopamine is included in all of them. Alcohol, the most widely abused substance for youth. And here's a beautiful, albeit unfortunate, study that illustrates the effects. These two 15-year-old boys did a functional MRI study while they were taking a memory test. They were also having a picture taken of their brain. And it's really obvious that our non-drinking 15-year-old has a lot more electrical activity and blood flowing in his brain than our heavy drinking kid. But you guys, check out the structural differences here that you don't kind of notice right away. Remember, when you have long strings of neurons that are forming, they squish together, making all those funky grooves in the brain that you can clearly see happening for our non-drinker, but not for our drinker. You see diffuse arrested development here for our heavy drinker. If we talk about marijuana, we have to talk about higher potency, genetically modified marijuana. Back in 1970, when I was born, it was like 2% THC. In Houston these days, it's 25, 26%. You guys that live in states where it's legal, it can be up to 99%. You guys know there are some bills that have been proposed to limit it, but it's amazing because I saw some of the limits at like 25%, which is still 4 to 5 times more potent than what it should have been as a naturally organic plant. So this is a beautiful, like I said, albeit unfortunate study. These are borrowed from the Amen Clinic. It's a SPECT scan that's looking from the bottom of the brain up through it. If all your neurons are connected and there is electrical activity and blood flowing all over the brain, you'll see a nice smooth surface. But these two kiddos have been using marijuana for long periods of time and on a very regular basis. And you can see the areas that kind of look like holes are not holes. They're just areas that aren't connected. There's no blood flowing or electrical activity in those parts because they're not developed yet, which is so scary because the biggest areas that are lacking are right there. There's the frontal lobe. And so I popped this slide in because it's important to remember that we've actually had decades of science that has really uncovered just how harmful marijuana is. And I really want you guys to hear from me that there really have been 3 levels of science, or 3 populations they're looking at. They're looking at people who use a little bit, people who use moderately, and people who are chronically users, meaning every day, other day. And so this is back in 2014, this is just a summary of the research that had been done up until that time. We know that marijuana, specifically THC, is highly addictive. The stronger it gets, the worse, the more potent it gets, the stronger the addiction. We know for a fact that it causes abnormal brain development. And this is really in the group of kids who are moderate to severe users. The kids who are low or experimental, they have the beauty of plasticity on their side. They may use a little bit, stop for a while, their brain heals, unarrests, and hopefully can catch back up to them. But we also know that there is a medium level of knowledge. It's not medium. It's really the level of confidence, a medium level of confidence that it is causes a progression to other drugs, that it is linked in a causal link to schizophrenia and depression. We have seen so many studies over time that shows a really high level of confidence that it diminishes lifetime achievement, IQ score, happiness levels, how much money that you even make. And these are, of course, in the moderate to severe categories, as well as bronchitis and other lung issues. And of course, we know that the process of extracting hash oil resins really has an increases the amount of THC in these products by 4 to 5 times. I had a man who was in his 30s come to see me. This was now almost 4 years ago, but he came in and he said that he had been smoking marijuana, the green bud, 2 to 3 times a year since his 20s, since college. And that to me is really a recreational drug habit, right? 2 to 3 times a year, like special occasions. And then the last time he'd gone to buy weed from his drug dealer said, "Oh, we're not selling bud anymore. We're just selling dabs." And he taught him how to vape and to use dabs. And then within 2 years' time, he was a 6 dabber a day. 6 times a day this guy was using. And he came to me finally because he had driven his kids to school high and just really hit bottom with it. Okay, so those are the 2 most widely abused substances. Now we're going to really delve into just a few behaviors. I studied 18 different high-risk behaviors and put them in the book because our kids are inundated with so many different risks these days. Really, thank goodness to the internet, who brings that into our lives so quickly. But anything that spikes dopamine has the potential to become addictive. And so the first one that I wanted to put was food addiction, because the food industry knows. Oh, sorry, I've got a cat who's sneezing in the back. The food industry knows that if they put more sugar into food, oh my gosh, more sugar into things that don't even need to be sweeter can cause addiction. I actually did a survey this year, you guys, with a high school, and in the qualitative section, over 104 students mentioned that they wanted information about food addiction because they couldn't control their weight gain. And this was high school students. I thought this was just amazing, and kids are struggling with it all over. And so here's a study that illustrates the effect. This is looking from the back of the brain through, and what you see is somebody who has no eating disorder or food addiction right after they ingested sugar. The brain lights up in different places because it loves sugar. And here is a picture of somebody who is a sugar addict after ingesting sugar. You can see, this is a really cool, this was a show on abcnews.com, so you could even watch this if you can find it online, but it was really interesting to see. Her limbic system is on both sides of her spinal cord here, and if we flipped her brain around, you'd see the frontal lobe would be just off, totally off. The second one that I see so much of is technology addiction. And this is an internet cafe in China where we have gotten so much amazing literature about technology addiction. It's changed their country so much. They've had to put in technology walkways to keep people safe. And we see these now in New York and Washington, D.C. They have tech walkways in our country now because people are walking out in traffic. Like this little girl that's a dangerous place to be when people are on TikTok, man. So this study really illustrates it's a really good example too. I saw a lot of studies that look just like this one, but this was back in 2013 that I found this study. And what they did was they looked at brain connectivity in two groups of teens. The first group was a minimal internet user. And if you connect all these red dots, you'd see their brain connectivity. Like if you did a functional MRI, you'd see lights all around the brain for those kids. Then they did the same fMRIs on a group of kids who dropped out of high school, and they spent 12 or more hours a day in the internet cafes. All they did, surf the internet, play video games. And you can see in the purple, their brain connectivity. And this is such an amazing example of use it or lose it, because if you look here, you can see there's this dense area of connections. This is the part of the brain that they're using the most. Think use it or lose it. So what you got here is the motor and sensory cortex. That's what they're using. If you look at how many networks they have into their frontal lobe, it's like one network is developing, as opposed to all these other networks that are indicated by the red dots for the healthier kids. That's so scary, you guys, because think of these whole generations of people. I wrote this too in the book, because Japan named it Hikikomori syndrome, which is basically shut-ins who all they do is surf the net and they don't do anything else. They grow up and their parents are too embarrassed because of shame to get them help. So they just wall them off in their homes and bring them food, and they really just don't do anything else. It's so scary to me. 1 million children in Japan have been diagnosed with Hikikomori syndrome. Here we call it technology addiction or video game addiction. And finally, the ICD-9, the WHO organization, validated the diagnosis, but we really have more and more of this today. Okay, my last behavior that I wanted to talk about is porn addiction, because here are the numbers. Average age, first accidental exposure to porn, 9. Average age, first porn search, purposeful search, 10. 70% of youth age 13 are using porn. So here is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing young men who are so freaked out by this that they have lots of anxiety about it. And I see a lot of poor guys who've been using porn for so long that the dopamine spike that they get from porn can't compete with the dopamine spike that they get from real life humans. And a study came out in 2019 that indicated that a half an hour viewing of pornography is equal to the same amount of dopamine that you might get if you snorted a line of cocaine. Remember that cocaine was 350% and sex was 150%. And so it is having a really negative effect. And this is the cleanest graphic that I could find to illustrate the effect. And so back in 2013, back in 2011, you started seeing medical journals reporting sky-high erectile dysfunction, higher in the age group 18 to 25 than 65 and over. Sex happens in our brain before it happens anywhere else. I actually worked with a young lady who masturbated so ferociously on a daily basis to pornography that she had vaginal damage, and she could not become sexually aroused from anything besides porn. 24-year-old woman who said, why should I meet people and have sex when I have porn? And so the dependency that it's creating looks just like a drug addiction. All right, so we are rounding the corner to the end, you guys. So I'm going to talk about prevention and recovery, which, yep, it looks like this. What we want to do is have long networks of neurons for healthy coping behavior. We want frontal lobes that stay on, so those executive functioning skills grow. And that's why I go back to this. In my book, I wrote about being a brain-based parent and using brain-based praise. And so you will read all about how to memorize these skills and watch them in your kids. And when you see them, praise them. Like, oh my God, I love how you organized that. You totally did that without even me asking. Wow, you really solved that problem in an amazing way. Tell me more about that. And so in the chapter 6, I have scripts for these too. So you know how to say it on a daily basis and watch for it. When you reinforce executive functioning skills, they go up. They use them more often instead of losing them. But if you are an over-functioning parent, what's happening when you solve your kids' problems for them is that you are creating long strings of neurons in their brain for dependency on you, not independent problem solving. And so once your kids move into phase 2 of brain development, that's when you put on the trainer hat. You leave the directorship behind and you start training that frontal lobe to be fully self-supporting when they have the frontal lobe to do it. Okay, this is a list of all of the things that I have read about in the past 45 years of prevention science literature. I've boiled it down into a simple list. So I'm going to go through these and explain a little bit about what I'm talking about. And there's one that I forgot to put in here, which drives me nuts, but I'll make sure to get it. So the first one is genetic testing. And I think if you have it in your family background, it is incumbent upon you to get a test if you can afford to do it, because then you have amazing information. And I'll show you a little bit about where to buy those and where to, what it looks like. But you can create a tailored prevention program for the kids who have the higher genetic load. And if you want to know what yours is, you can really help you with treatment planning for adult substance use or high-risk behavior. We want to make sure that we give our kids consistent education in schools and homes. This is why I'm putting together an online prevention program with a local charity here in Houston to provide a plug and play prevention program that schools can use and parents can log into at home and students can use as well. But it's really important to do this consistently. And so I'll give you a few tips on how to integrate that at home. The third thing here is pro-social activity. So this is so interesting and it's kind of self-explanatory, because when kids drop out of soccer because they're sick of it, or they don't want to do debate club anymore because they're way over it, if they don't enroll in another pro-social, that time that they have on their hands will get curious, and the chances of them engaging in high-risk behavior, kids who have more downtime have significantly higher risk. Not to mention, pro-social activity helps create those long strings of neurons. And I know it's a lot of driving, but man, it is worth it. And so I don't mean to overbook your kids. We don't want to cause anxiety, but we do want to have the rule that when they are in a school that actually hosts these activities, that the rule is you have to be involved in one pro-social every semester. And that can be in or out. I actually have a girl, she can't stand sports and she doesn't like anything else her school has to offer, but she loves karate. And so she is active in a karate club that meets outside of school. And that counts as her pro-social. The next thing you want to do is create a family code of ethics. And I've got one on the next page, and there's a family code building activity in the book. A family code brings families together in unity, and it gives them a guide on how to think and act in the world, but you got to keep it simple. So I'll show you that in a second. And then you make sure that you role play refusal skills. I have a section in the book too on refusal skills and what those sound like and look like. Make sure your kid develops their own hip, slick, and cool refusal skills. And so you practice with them. Like if you go to the party and somebody offers you drugs, what are you going to say? And they're like, dude, I don't know what I'm going to. Well, this is what I'd want you to say. Now you try it. Role play with me. Literally do that with them a couple times a year. And you can do it literally within that 30-second time block that I just did it. It doesn't have to be a speech. It shouldn't be a speech. You want to make sure that you continue regular family dinners, which is harder as kids get older because they're so busy. But the goal is to try to hit 5 meals shared together per week. The literature shows that when we go down to 1 to 2, parents lose touch with their kids' lives. They know a whole lot less of what's going on. And so if you're a social worker or a teacher or a counselor, and you just reinstitute family meals into a family system of a kid who might be using drugs, you will see the drug use go down just with that activity. It creates unity, time for communication, and accountability. And then we also want to give kids consistent consequences. What is not on this list that I always keep forgetting is we want to do drug testing. I have read a lot of the research about this, and it's interesting. People come out for or against it, but because, you know, it's a privacy thing. People don't like the invasion of privacy. But here is what I have found in the literature, and also when I work with schools who do drug testing, and I have interviewed kids, cat crossing, I have interviewed kids about how they feel about it. And predominantly, I hear and read in the literature that kids are grateful when schools do it because it gives them the #1 refusal skill. So this is what I want you to teach parents how to do. When your child turns 11, 12, you give them their birthday presents and you say, happy birthday, here's your presents and here's a cup. You put a nice little red ribbon around it. And they'll be like, what is this, Mom? And you're going to go, okay, this is your #1 refusal skill. Now, from here on out, now that you're in phase 2 of brain development, I'm going to drug test you, I don't know, randomly once or twice a year. And when you go to the party and so gives you something and says, here, try this, you can throw me under the bus and say, man, my mom drug tests me. You're going to get tons of empathy. Like kids are going to be like, oh, dude, so sorry. That sucks, man. But you'll be able to come home scot-free, right? You throw me under the bus. And then you'll have them ready because if you suspect that they have, then you're able to say, I smell something. Okay, let's do a drug test. It is one of the hardest things for a parent to do with their kids because kids will say, what? Don't you trust me? Here's what I want you to say. No, I don't completely trust you. I trust the part of your brain that's grown and developed, but I don't trust the part that's not. So, man, I'm going to be the good parent. I'm going to be your frontal lobe until you grow one of your own. And so pee in this cup. I know it's uncomfortable. And if it's positive, make sure you go big the first time. When parents refuse to give consequences or they go so lax, the kid translates that into, oh, my parents don't care. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that in real life. So make sure you give the consequence. And then keep your kids active in community, churches, Habitat for Humanity, feeding the homeless. Make sure you integrate that into your family culture. Even if you just do it once a year on Thanksgiving, it's a really healthy thing that teaches kids absolutely amazing frontal lobe skills. And then, of course, treat the problems immediately. If you've got a kiddo who has experimented, okay, I get that. Make sure you give them a big consequence. And if they go 6 months and they don't do it again, great, but they do it again, please go see a counselor that can help create a plan going forward. Okay, here's the family code activity. You can borrow mine. There's one in the book. It's just a really simple code. Ours is in our family. We treat others with kindness, compassion, and respect on and offline. We take good care of our brain, and we do not engage in risky behavior. We never use drugs and only use alcohol when we're 21 or over. You hang that up somewhere in the house. And then, so in the book, I have a calendar of conversation starters. And so if you go to the calendar and you see, oh, you know what? This month is eating disorders month. Did you guys know what an eating disorder is at the family dinner table? And they're going to be like, I don't know. What is that, Mom? And then you can look up the book and you can go and say, oh, here's what an eating disorder is. Do you guys know anybody that? Well, we wouldn't do that because we take good care of our brain development. Then next month, you're going to go to the next month and go, oh my God, today's like no tobacco day. Have you guys know about vaping? Have you seen anything? What's going on? Have you heard? You can talk about it at family dinner. And then you can say, yeah, we wouldn't do that in our family because we protect our brain and we just don't do drugs ever. And then when your kid's going out to that risky situation, you know, like the basketball game at night or the sleepover at a friend's house, you can say, hey, what's the family code? Be a good rep of the family code. And if your kid's like, oh my God, mother, the family code is wah, 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 wah. That should be music to your ears. All right. So here is the genetic risk score information. It's the company that I got mine through is called Genus Health. And the test is called the GARS score. And it will test you for 2,200 genes that are important in the synthesis of these neurotransmitters. And it's amazing. I got mine done about 4.5 years ago. And my test said, oh, your genes predict that you will do cocaine, alcohol, and nicotine. Those were the 3 drugs that I did. It was amazing how accurate it is. It will also give you information on what your genes predispose you to that's non-substance use, that is impulsive disorder, anxiety disorders, and also different personality issues and psychotic issues. So you can know what your child or you are at risk for genetically, specifically. And I just found this really amazing because they also give you suggestions for natural supplements that you can take to help boost some of the things that some of the neurotransmitters. I had no idea how effective methylfolate was at helping your brain to produce more dopamine until I started taking it after I got my genetic test. And so I've taken it ever since, which I learned about it from all the genetic testing. And you guys, here are my references. These are just a few. Of course, there's a large section in the book that has quite a lot more. And here's what the book likes. You can buy it on Amazon. It is in English and in Spanish. Guía de la Neurolocalización is the Spanish version of the Neuro Whereabouts Guide. And I was telling these guys earlier that I'm going to put together a book club, a video book club to help people go through it, you know, at a certain kind of pace since it's kind of big. But please remember that there's a quick guide in the very beginning, so you can go straight to the section you need. Or the skill that you want to use. You do not have to read this all at once. It really is a guide. There's an elementary, middle, and high school chapter, so you can go straight to the chapter that helps you with your child's particular issue or age. And now I haven't heard any questions yet. So golly, I hope I haven't put anybody to sleep, but please feel free to unmute and ask any question that you'd like to now.